Hello, everybody. Welcome to Narrative Live on a Tuesday night. We have a very special show tonight as we look into the Bausman file, which I think is one of the most interesting stories Narrative has ever covered, and it looks at the activities of Charles Bausman. And also, we're going to be looking at the broader militia movement in Pennsylvania, and that's why the guy next to me is here, Carter Walker. He's from the Lancaster Online newspaper. Carter, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on, and you have a great scoop about what happened at that January 3rd meeting, the 3 days before January the 6th, that happened in your region in Lancaster, and we'll get into that in a bit. On the other side, here's Grant Stern, the very famous, legendary Grant Stern. I've never seen you with a beard that is fulsome as this. How are you tonight?
The beard is fine. I'm okay.
I'm so excited you're here because we're going to dig into Bausman's sort of intelligence network, which is fascinating and interesting and very revealing about who he is or might be. And also, just here in voice only, Gal Suburban. We all know her online. Sometimes you have a very name that I can't even repeat, Gal, but so we won't try to say it now. But if this was a family show, we wouldn't repeat it. But we can swear on the show, but I'm still not going to say it. How are you doing, Gal?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you on. And you've got this incredible find that you got out of Russian television, which is Bausman basically spinning January the 6th to a Russian audience. And we're going to play a little bit of that video coming up a little later on. So there's a lot to deal with, plus 3 different subpoenas that just came from the January the 6th committee. And Gal, you've got the names on those, don't you? It'll be good to just run through everybody, who the 3 people are, and then get some ideas on who they might represent. I think one of them was Arthur Schwartz, which is a name that Grant recognized. And how do you recognize Arthur Schwartz, and why do you recognize him?
Oh, because he sends me mean tweets sometimes.
Oh, he does?
He doesn't mean tweet you?
No, that I'm aware of. I better go back and check.
So he's like Donald Trump Jr.'s best friend.
And
a publicist.
Publicist.
Yeah.
That's his official term. And
what's his publicist?
We know what he did for January the 6th. What's the story there with his involvement?
Probably hung out with Donald Trump Jr. I mean, if I had to guess,
get those subpoenas while we all talk, and then we'll take a good look at what was going on there. Gal, do you have the names in the meantime?
What they're saying about, Andy Sarabian, I think it is, and Arthur Schwartz both served as advisors to Donald Trump Jr. And it looks like they are saying that they were communicating with individuals like Kimberly Guilfoyle regarding the rally, so maybe setup or something. I haven't read the entire subpoena yet, but it looks like overall it was assisting with the former president's speech on the 6th. So that's an important one. That's Ross Worthington, who may have been the speechwriter.
I haven't heard that name before. Have any of you heard that name before?
No, I don't know who Ross Worthington is.
It's interesting. The speech was
sounds like a fake name.
It does, doesn't it? All of them sound a little fake. But it's interesting that Arthur Schwartz, I think he's got ties to Israel, if I'm not mistaken. There's some deep ties, which wouldn't surprise me because of the Trump administration's ties back there anyhow. But do you know anything about his ties there, Grant, or anything like that?
No, I can't say right now. The subpoenas are coming out,
So we'll get the subpoenas, and we'll see what else we can find out about them, and we'll keep talking about the 3 new subpoenas. These are interesting names. They sort of are names that are not public figures, but are clearly behind the scenes, very important in terms of getting Trump sort of setting up that day for Donald Trump. So let's move to your story, Carter, because it's so interesting. This came out of we first came across the story when we spoke about Charles Bausman, who's this now quite famous provocateur. Maybe he's a disinformation agent for Russia. He ran an organization and a newspaper called Russia Insider. And that Russia Insider appears to have been not only sort of a mouthpiece for Kremlin propaganda, but also a real organizing point for right-wing militias, and also the National Justice Party, which is the closest thing we have to the Nazi party here. And that all happened at this barn that he has, which is in your neighborhood there. Is that right? He has this barn that seems to be a gathering point of extremists.
He opened up his barn to the National Justice Party members. He had met them through the Right Stuff Network and done a couple of podcast shows with them, I believe. And you're right, over on Millersville Pike, which is probably about 3 miles from where I'm sitting right now. In August of 2020, he let them use his facility to hold their formation meeting.
Yeah, this is the barn in question. It's unusually secluded in a sort of a suburban neighborhood. It doesn't feel like it's that rural, but it seems to be quite secluded with those trees surrounding it. And it was also the place where on the January the 3rd, Bausman also met with Sean Moon. So that is an interesting connection, that on January the 3rd, two of the most significant, or two very significant people who attended January the 3rd, Bausman, who's, obviously, or not obviously, but seems to be connected to the Russian Orthodox Church, and then also the Reverend Sean Moon of the Moonies, were there on January the 3rd at the barn, this barn in question. But that's not where the story we're talking about takes place, because there was, according to one indictment, that one person was alleged by the feds that they had advised everyone that there was going to be a meeting of leaders that was taking place in Lancaster. And that's when we first heard about this January the 3rd meeting. Is that right, Carter?
Yeah, the guy you're referencing is James Bremy. He's a oath keeper out of New Jersey who was arrested for storming the Capitol on January 6th.
And in that indictment, they talk about him inviting people to come to this meeting, particularly the head of the Oath Keepers, and inviting him to come there for a meeting of the leaders. And it was also going to be a very secret meeting, right? There was no cell phones, and it was meant to be all hush-hush, and only the leadership was going to be there.
Right. I believe it was on December 21st, he sent that text, said this is going to be for leadership only, so we can get our comms on point, ahead of the show, which he was referencing, the show being the January 6th rally. Stuart Rhodes didn't accept his invitation, but Bremy was certainly billing it as, this coordination meeting where people were going to get their communications together and, make sure they were aligned with other groups before they got down there on the 6th.
Now, you found out that that's not, in fact, what happened. That meeting that took place, or the meeting that's believed to have taken place, was not as a meeting of leaders. It was a meeting basically about radios.
Right, yeah. What I found was I was able to talk to the gentleman who had rented the facility. It was at the Solanco Fairgrounds, which they host, swap meets and farmers markets, the fair, obviously, things like that. But you can also rent out these buildings for private events. And I spoke with the guy who rented that building, as well as another attendee of that meeting on January 3rd, and acquired a PowerPoint, too, that was displayed at the meeting. And what all that showed and what they all told me was that, this is basically a group of preppers, people who are interested in, preparing for the end of the world or natural disasters or that type of thing, talking about how they could coordinate their communications with each other in the event of any natural disaster. It touched on armed resistance a little bit, but
so this is just a meeting of preppers. It was not intended to be a setup for January the 6th.
Yeah, well, that's certainly the impression the people who were there gave me, that basically how they put it was, well, we were here to talk about prepping and communication for prepping, but there were a couple of people, my sources put it as one nut job, and I think he was referring to Bremy, wanted to talk about January 6th and make it about January 6th. But
it seems to have made sense. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of people in your part of the world who are heading to January the 6th on January the 3rd. So it certainly feels like it could have been an interesting place to have a meeting. Certainly the Moonies and the Bausman were there. It seems like some of the Oath Keepers were there. Were any other big groups there on January the 3rd that you're aware of?
Well, you might know already, we had a protest outside of Pennsylvania House Speaker Brian Cutler's home that day, which, was attended by some Stop the Steal activists and other folks like that. Reopen PA, which is a group, was pushing to end pandemic lockdowns. I believe they were there also. And I believe Bausman was actually there with the Moonies as well at this rally outside of Cutler's house, which is actually in Quarryville. And as far as I can tell, I think those two events were going on at the same time. But it's not clear if anybody from one event crossed over to the other. Right,
so just simultaneous events, but nothing planning January the 6th that you're aware of.
Well, the meeting from this PowerPoint, which I want to point out, I was able to verify independent of the person who gave it to me that this was actually what was shown at this meeting. Certainly if you scroll through it, you see that there's nothing referencing January 6th in there specifically. But, as the folks who were there were telling me, there were people at the end of the meeting that wanted to talk about January 6th. I didn't get to speak to any of those people, so it's unclear what conversations they might have had after that, if there's anything other than just them trading phone numbers. But as far as I could tell, planning January 6th didn't seem to be the main focus of the meeting.
It's amazing how many PowerPoints are involved in trying to overthrow the government of the United States of America. This is at least the second one I can think of. They're talking about, in order to train for possibilities, we need to stay under the radar of enforcement bodies. that sounds like it could be used under very different terms or under different situation. Keep to FCC regulations as much as possible, blend into background traffic. And the rest of this sort of goes on and talks about how basically to operate the radio frequencies and to, go undetected, or at least not be too much of a presence, so that you might get detected if you're using these emergency frequencies and the like. I mean, there's nothing that significant. The only thing that did really stand up to me is that they did speak about these Chinese walkie-talkies, which were walkie-talkies that they used on January the 6th. They used these Chinese-issued walkie-talkies. And I think they point out here that the walkie-talkies are not actually limiting to certain bands. So those walkie-talkies allow you, if they're made in China, to use some of these emergency frequencies or these frequencies which you normally wouldn't have access to.
Right. I think one of the more interesting things from the PowerPoint, if you scroll up to the very second slide, right after the title slide, they talk there about, should be a little bit above that, they talk about fourth and fifth generation warfare.
Oh, that's interesting.
Which is, I'm not an expert on that. I don't want to claim to be, but from what I understand is how in a modern war setting, a smaller force could confront a larger force. And one of the quotes I have in the story from one of the guys attending this that really struck me, I guess, is he was telling me that a lot of the folks in the militia and prepper movements or these, anti-government movements, of course, they wouldn't characterize themselves that way, but that's beside the point. But they kind of view the need to stage a resistance or at some point in the future to defend themselves against a tyrannical government as something that's inevitable. And he told me that a lot of people in these circles see the political process as broken. So I thought that was interesting that, while perhaps maybe their emergency natural disasters might have been their main focus, it's certainly in the back of their mind or at the forefront. You can see this is the second slide that they might need to stage an armed resistance at some point in the future.
Yeah, that is really fascinating. The only person I know who talks about the fourth and fifth generation warfare is Dave Troy. Grant, do you know much about fourth and fifth generation warfare? Is that something that rings a bell to you in terms of what does it mean?
I mean, it's a nice buzzword. It just means modern warfare. Hybrid warfare is what most people call it. Asymmetric warfare. Those are more commonly used terms. I mean,
so this is unusual for a prepper meeting, although you could sort of understand why they might want to be planning for this. It could also apply, of course, to the events that could follow January the 6th.
Right. I think a lot of these folks were, at the time, they felt that martial law was imminent to be imposed. So I think that's why they wanted to get their communications in line, because they felt we were about to enter this type of situation where maybe resistance becomes necessary.
And I can add to, Zeb, for you, being down in Florida, there's a lot of these groups that I wouldn't even say that their main focus is disaster relief. I think they utilize disaster relief to train for the inevitable war that they foresee. So I actually think they use the nonprofits and the 501c3s of these groups that can go in and do, disaster relief to acquire supplies, equipment, and then also train tax-free.
I don't think there's any state in the nation that allows private militias, really. So, what she's saying is pretty accurate. And I noticed that you said that there was discussion of the head of the Oath Keepers, Stuart Rhodes, going to this meeting, but he didn't attend. And, there's a big controversy unfolding about, how they handle Mr. Rhodes, but pretty much all of his associates that attended January 6th have been arrested and charged with conspiracy, but he was named as an unindicted co-conspirator. So, we just saw the Attorney General come out and give his first major public statement about January 6th. And one of the things he mentioned is that whether you're there or not, we're looking at you, we may charge you. That would apply to him.
But he has not been charged and likely won't.
He's named as an unindicted co-conspirator in a conspiracy case, or at least he's named in the case. I don't think he's called an unindicted co-conspirator. There's so many indictments in the
So that could mean he's either cooperating. He could be cooperating.
That's what I think.
Yeah. Or,
in theory, there's no reason to speculate. It's just enough to say that a lot of his associates have been charged. The conspiracy cases, and those are the more, serious cases from January 6th. Those are people that are being accused of conspiring to stop a government process from happening.
Right.
An official proceeding.
A lot of this, is so fascinating because of the timing and the location. I mean, Carter, you live in an area where a lot of activity was going on when it comes to planning for January the 6th and just in terms of the growth of extremism. And Grant was saying just before we got on the air, I mean, the location's kind of perfect between, I guess, New York and DC, but also, bridging into some of the heartland. But, this is a map I've just got of Bausman and the Moonies, how close they are to their location. And it's interesting that Bausman, who came from Russia, even though he was born in this area, chose to resettle here for his, launch of his publication and also his, one would think some sort of operation that he was involved in.
Mm-hmm.
So why is there so much extremism?
Well, I think that's hard to say. Lancaster's had a long history, unfortunately, with activity like this. We've had several KKK rallies over the years and chapters here as well. We had Identity Europa here just a few years ago, and it does seem to, South Central PA in general just has had a lot of extremist anti-government activity as well as white nationalist activity over the year. I think it's hard to know exactly what about this area I think produces that, or if folks around here who hold those beliefs are more open to expressing them.
It sort of goes with the history of Pennsylvania as well, doesn't it? I mean, there's a lot of that sort of independent thinking going on there.
Well, if I might jump in, I'm not a local, but, in my research, we found that there was a lot of Russian activity centered around southeastern Pennsylvania and specifically Philadelphia. And, I'd have to dig through some very extensive notes to tell you, but there's this one group that we were monitoring, and they actually set up like a little house, and we mapped it out, and it was in, southern New Jersey. And when we mapped it out, it was like right in between Brighton Beach and Philadelphia, like the midpoint. And I think that just kind of tells you, there's been a lot of immigration to those areas. There's large communities there. And, one of our big focuses of research was former Republican Congressman Curt Weldon, who interestingly worked on a plan to get $100 million over to the head of the FSB because, as he said at the time, he's in with Putin. Which is objectively true. And by the way, the same head of the FSB today. That was interestingly in Wired magazine.
Wow.
So, Weldon was Dana Rohrabacher before Dana Rohrabacher was Dana Rohrabacher in the public eye when it comes to like your pro-Russia, your Russophile members of Congress.
Right.
Didn't Weldon speak on the House floor in, I think it was like 2014, 2015, to get Tony Schaefer's security clearance returned to him?
Oh, that's very interesting. I hadn't heard anything about that.
He did. Okay. It was in October of 2014, and Tony Schaefer, he was dealing with an incident where he lost his top secret security clearance working with at the DIA. And Curt Weldon went on the House floor and basically scolded the DOD for taking away Tony Schaefer's security clearance. So that's really interesting that you bring him up.
That's why I love having all these people together that are not normally in the same room, because you've all got such incredible knowledge. It's great to have you share them. That is really interesting. So before you leave Carter's reporting here, Carter, is there anything else you think we need to know about your part of the world there, about Pennsylvania in particular, but also about the as the growing concern around extremism continues to be an issue heading into the elections this year?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. We've had other things happen here, like you mentioned, with the National Justice Party, and following right now some stickering, which, if you guys are familiar with, it's like a propaganda method where folks will put, stickers with messages and QR codes. And I'm looking to keep an eye on that, see what kind of activity we see in 2022, as well as, election misinformation. One of the things I'm really curious to see, and hopefully we'll get some more information about this if and when the January 6th committee ever publishes a report. But obviously, Speaker Brian Cutler had two phone calls, I believe, with Donald Trump in that post-election period. So it'd be great if we can get some more information about what was said on that.
That's interesting. I'm surprised that hasn't come out yet. That's a really good thing to look for. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate your reporting here, because it's rare to find, and I got to say, I'm impressed that your newsroom is doing this kind of stuff. And I think that's because of a special initiative that is happening at your newspaper group where, more investigative journalists are being hired.
Yeah, we have a nonprofit wing through the organization that owns the newspaper called the Lancaster County Local Journalism Fund. And this is one of their initiatives, was to fund my position covering extremism and hate groups and misinformation. So they're making a commitment, I think, to cover our community, not just in daily coverage, which was what I was doing, but in a more in-depth way.
Sounds great. It's a really important initiative. I hope other newsrooms do that. And, we need a lot more eyes, especially in smaller communities, as to what's going on. So that's fantastic. And good job. Definitely. Great story. You broke a big one here. And keep us informed if anything else comes up. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. I definitely will. And thank you for having me.
Thanks very much for being here, Carter. That's Carter Walker from the Lancaster Online newspaper. I'm going to say goodbye to you, Carter, and then I'm just going to bring up Grant here and just go, there you go. Thanks. That's great. Carter did a good job with that article. I've been trying to figure out what happened on January 3rd for a long, long time. And then there he was being able to crack that. So it still feels to me a little suspicious, doesn't it, Grant? It feels like there's something here that could have been perhaps relevant to January the 6th. I don't know.
You know, obviously there's a link to January the 6th, but there's also a lot of people in these kind of circles that are very aspirational. And judging by what I could read from that PowerPoint, maybe they could have used some communications training after all.
Gal, what did you think of it?
Did we talk to anybody, or did he get a chance to see what was actually spoken of? Because the PowerPoint really,
It's a lot about the
I think it probably would be mundane. Yeah. I think they wouldn't probably write anything down in particular for, something that they were planning. It would be probably more verbal.
Right. They're not going to be advertising here's how we're going to take over the government right after we overthrow the election. So yeah, probably not in a PowerPoint. Although they did have a PowerPoint, another one showing exactly how they would use it. So maybe.
And I did notice he did have to omit a few pages from his source that he received that PDF from. So there could be more there that just he wasn't able to disclose the source.
Yeah. There's another piece of this article here at the bottom, which talks about he had another source who didn't attend that meeting, who had a separate list of things that they were going to get for January the 6th that he said were passed around at that meeting. So that might have been an indication that there was something else maybe going on the sidelines of that meeting that we're not aware of in terms of the main agenda. So certainly worth keeping an eye on that. Should we turn now to Bausman? Because I'm just fascinated by this guy. Not that we haven't spoken about him, but let's reset everybody on who he really is. He claims to be a legitimate American business owner, that he happened to be the son of an Associated Press, I think it was bureau chief out of Russia, and spent many of his years growing up in Russia, but also spent some time in the United States. And his decision to start Russia Insider came out of him being in Moscow and being really frustrated by the type of news, he said, or the news coverage that Russians were getting. And so he started this publication and then decided to move back to the United States just in time for, I think it was 2016 when he moved back maybe, or maybe 2017, just in time for his, to plan to take part in the radicalization of some parts of Pennsylvania. Because at that barn that we showed you earlier on, which is one of 3 properties that he bought when he arrived back in Pennsylvania, he held a bunch of meetings, including one for the launch of the National Justice Party. So Grant, this guy is, in my opinion, and I'll just say this is my opinion, he's a disinformation agent. And I think we've been able to prove that he has ties to the Russian Orthodox Church, and that's through specifically Alexei Kobov, who's an operative for the Russian Orthodox Church, but ultimately directly tied to Konstantin Malofeev, who is the oligarch who's friendliest with the Russian Orthodox Church and obviously very friendly to Vladimir Putin as well. And Alexei Kobov is also the guy who does a lot of the homeschooling operations in the United States. He's sort of a pretty adept kind of operative. And these two, Charles Bausman and Alexei Kobov, have communications going between them where Bausman is asking Kobov to arrange funding for Russian Insider from Malofeev. So it does seem to me that you can say with a certain amount of confidence, that there's a Russian operative, or at least an operative for the Russian Orthodox Church. Would you concur?
I can't tell you if he's an operative for the Russian Orthodox Church, but I can tell you that the Russian Orthodox Church was captured by the Soviet Union many decades ago, and it is actively deployed by the intelligence services of Russia. So it's not like a normal church. And if you've been following what's happening in Ukraine, one of the big things that happened is that there was a schism between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Orthodox Church. So, his ties to the Russian Orthodox Church are unusual. His ties to Mr. Malofeev are also something that's highlight worthy. He was involved in the Russian efforts to infiltrate the NRA. He's a financier. And Mr. Bausman is, he's a propagandist. As you said, disinformation agent. That's a not inaccurate description of what his job is. I mean, I don't think that he doesn't believe what he's saying, which is, not unusual in the propagandist space. But, you're right. His timing around parachuting back into America is a little bit suspect looking, just considering about all the foreign interference that we've seen over the last several years, and then ending with January 6th and his departure. And I would just point out that he's not the first American, and he's not going to be the last one to fall under the spell of Russia's good graces. And they all wound up traveling there. I mean, I think that's pretty much every one of these stories involving involving someone getting tied up with Russia involves some sort of trip to Moscow.
That's so
it's
true.
like, I mean,
very
it's
cheap. Apparently, Americans are quite cheap to buy. All you need is a trip to Moscow and a couple of good vodkas, and you've got them. But
sometimes more than that. But yes, yes, it's just there's always a trip to Moscow involved, and then all of a sudden, weird things happen, and we can point at a lot of different people where that happened. With General Michael Flynn, took a trip to Russia, had dinner with Putin. All of a sudden, criminal investigations, etc. I'm streamlining that story tremendously.
Yeah. I want to just quickly, before we, there's a couple of things I want to get to Bausman, but Galdi, is anything you want to say in particular about, we look at this group of people that surrounds Konstantin Malofeev, and I'm always fascinated by this group because there's Charles Bausman, of course. Ed Lazansky is going to feature in our conversation in just a bit, so we're going to hold off on talking to him. But there's also Alexander Dugin, who's sort of the mastermind of, the way the world is going to look in the new Russian empire. And then Jack Hannock, who used to work for Sean Hannity at Fox News, of all people. So, does that tell you anything, Gal?
It does. So Alexander Dugin also was pretty close to Alex Jones. And so when I look at kind of this disinformation chaos agent circle, it leads me a lot to where Alex Jones may come up with his theories or, work on his theories. I have a video that I think I sent you a clip where Charles and Alex are talking, and apparently Charles and the Russian television network were doing a documentary on Alex Jones because he just gets all the stories on Russia so correct. Can you imagine? So,
I found
and
he was also awarded. He was also awarded a humanitarian award by the public-facing group of the SVR. So the same year, I think that maybe it was Bettina won the same year, that the two of them won an award at the same time. I didn't know that he was such a human rights figure, but there you go.
Yeah, I think Dugin's a very important figure because, no offense to either man, he's kind of like the Bannon of Russia in many ways.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of people that are involved in the Kation Institute, which is one of his power centers. And, his real role is as an ideologue or ideologist, but ideologue, somebody who's coming up with the ideas and the philosophies that they then take and spread around.
Gives them a theoretical underpinning or philosophical underpinning for why they can do what they're doing. And it does seem to hold to them together in some ways.
Well, Russia is kind of like that. They'll have an ideology, a doctrine. I always think about, the Hunt for Red October, and there's this one scene where, they just say, son, Russians don't take a fart without a plan. But they're invertebrate diarists, and they like the written word.
Absolutely. I've got a couple of things I want to show you about Bausman, which I think are going to be interesting. The first thing I want to play you is a clip. This is from I guess it was another propaganda effort that he was on some white nationalist talk show or podcast, and he was discussing American democracy. So let's listen to what he had to say about, his views of American democracy.
And what they've definitely done is they've rejected democracy. Now, they wouldn't be happy for me to say that because they make a big deal about their elections, and they claim that we're a democratic country, but that is definitely a fig leaf. And it's very interesting that many Russians think democracy is ridiculous and stupid and a fraud and a fake and something that that just doesn't work and should never be used as a way to govern the country. And it's openly discussed here on the talk shows. There are a lot of monarchists in Russia. The Russian church is very powerful and very influential, and they're straight up monarchists.
So, isn't that interesting? There he is talking about monarchies and, you think about autocracies. And certainly it's a point that they're arguing for, at least on the right wing, that, we should be returning to those days, even here in the United States. So he's pushing Putin's points directly there.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if there's one thing to say about what comes out of Russia, probably 90% of it is state propaganda. Yeah. I mean, that's very, very true. But also Red Ice is, that's a neo-Nazi podcast, right. The Red Ice podcast. There was an infamous incident with a Florida teacher who had a secret identity and went on there and then got exposed. Yes. And I think fired. But, one of the big things that you notice when you start researching all these Russian propagandist folks is that they tend to not have many problems with white nationalism, neo-Nazism, or any sort of right-wing extremism. They just don't seem very sensitive to it.
No, they don't. It seems to be they're quite in favor of it. He goes on in another clip. He talks about how, Russia's a very proudly a white Christian state. And, that really is the model that many people on the right think that the United States can become. Of course, it's impossible, but that's what they are trying to do.
Well, that is Duginism. It's traditionalism.
Yeah, right, exactly.
And it's ironic because you have people like Steve Bannon running around talking about globalists. I'll translate that for you, Jewish people. Mm-hmm. Meanwhile, he's going all over the world, with these traditionalist movements, whether it's the UK or Brazil or Italy. There's actually the traditionalist party in Austria, gained power and just recently started to lose it. But that's kind of the new playbook. It used to be the Communist International. Now it's the Neo-Naziist International.
I know. It's unbelievable we're living in this world. Thank you for spending your time with Narativ, and stay tuned. There's much more to this conversation in our next episode. Narativ is made possible by viewers and listeners like you who join at patreon.com/Narativ. Join today and support truly independent journalism. Patreon.com/Narativ.